Okay, we're ready? Okay, well, good evening, everyone. It's nice to be back together on our Wednesday night Bible study. And we're continuing in our studies of the writings of John, trying to see some things perhaps we haven't seen before. So if you'll bow your heads, we'll ask a blessing on the Bible study. Our eternal great God, we are very thankful to be here this evening. It's nice to be able to look into your word and to learn more about you and more about the teachings of Jesus Christ, our Savior. We thank you now for the many blessings that we have. We are certainly looking forward to being back together again and being able to assemble and convoke together and enjoy fellowship and exchanging our appreciation for your truths that we always do when your people meet together. But we ask for your blessing and guidance this evening as you protect each one of us as we are in the springtime of the year. And we thank you now for all of this. We just ask your help in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, well, good evening to everyone again. We don't have many announcements except this coming Sabbath services will be at 1:30, same time, same station. And we're beginning now our password protected telecast, but certainly anybody who would like to get the password and click onto and register with our local website, they can certainly get that information. So anyone who needs that, just please email any one of us. We sent the emails out to everybody in the church, and hopefully anybody else from other areas that would like to could also get that information. So tonight we're going to continue in our study of the book of John, and I want to begin over in John chapter 2 and verse 11. As many of you know, the number 7 is very prevalent in John's writings. And we have in the book of Revelation just, there's a list here I've got off Agape Bible Study. It says, there are 55 sevens mentioned in the book of Revelation and 5 sevenths. So the word seventh is there 5 times and 7, 55 times, which is a lot for one book, obviously. There are 7 churches, 7 letters to the churches, 7 spirits, 7 golden lampstands, 7 stars, 7 seals, 7 horns, 7 eyes, 7 angels, 7 trumpets, 7 thunders, 7,000 people, 7 heads, 7 crowns. There are 7 last plagues. There are 7 golden bowls. There are the 7 hills, Revelation 17:9. 7 kings, and the last 7 visions of chapters 20 and 21. So the number 7 is important. In one of our earlier Bible studies, we covered the 7 I am sayings in the book of John. I'm the bread of life, I'm the way and the truth and the life, and of course, a number of others. Tonight we're going to look at a little bit different aspect of the number 7, and that is what is known as the 7 signs in John's gospel. Not only does he mention the number 7 many times, but as a structure of his book. He lists 7 miracles, and those miracles or signs are all preludes to 7 key teachings in the book. So it's a very high form of literary structure for those who are students of rhetoric. But I want to begin with my Carson commentary on the book of John, and he mentions this kind of gives a pretty good little description here. He's starting here by John. Well, let's start at John chapter 2 and verse 11. Let me read that first. This is the beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him. So this is the beginning, in other words, the first of the 7 miracles or the 7 signs in the book of John. There are 6 that follow. If you count his resurrection, that would be 7, but he didn't perform that. God the Father did. God raised him up. So we have the beginning of his 7 miracles that Jesus did, and he did this in Cana of Galilee. But the purpose of these miracles, or these 7 signs, as it says here, is to manifest or make obvious, bring forth his glory. And his disciples then believed on him. So Carson's comment says this: John brings the account to a close here by an inclusio, a literary device that envelops a section by repeating something at the beginning and the end of the section. We've covered this before in our Bible studies. And this one is, of course, Cana of Galilee. This was the first of his miraculous signs on the enumeration of the first 2 signs and its alleged significance for a sign's source. The first word is arche or arch, also means primary. Just possible that John is saying the first sign is also a primary sign because it points to the new dispensation of grace and the fulfillment of what Jesus Christ is inaugurating. meaning changing the water into wine. His gospel or his message is about changing one substance into another, changing the heart of man into the heart of God, or giving us a new heart and becoming a new creature. The New Testament uses several words to denote what we will call miracles. One of the most common, dynamesis, which means mighty works, is not found in John. Another, terata, which means wonders or miracles, is found only when linked with semenia, which means signs. So wonders and signs, as in signs and wonders, but this combination is found only once in the fourth gospel. That's in chapter 4 and verse 48. John prefers the simple word signs. Jesus' miracles are never simply naked displays of power, still less neat conjuring up tricks to impress the masses. That's what false teachers do, not what Jesus Christ did. But his are signs, which are significant displays of power that point beyond themselves to the deeper realities that could be perceived with the eyes of faith. Jesus himself in this gospel refers to his miracles as other activity, as his work or his works. And each one of these signs is different than the others mentioned. He does not give the same type of miracle account over and over and over. He gives 7 separate ones because they all have separate meanings. By his first sign, Jesus began to reveal his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth, which is chapter 1 and verse 14. His glory would be revealed in the greatest measure on the cross, resurrection, and exaltation, but every step along the course of his ministry was an adumbration of that glory. The glory was not visible to all who had seen by miracle. The glory cannot be identified with the miraculous display. The servant saw the sign, but not the glory. The disciples, by faith, perceived Jesus' glory behind the sign, and they put some faith in him. Some hold that John has a scheme of 7 signs, culminating in the resurrection of Lazarus. And there's truth in that. The book, the core of the book, is written about these 7 particular signs or miraculous things that Jesus Christ did, and they are followed by a discourse to explain what that sign meant. Others link the feeding of the 5,000 and the walking on water as one sign, making the 7th the resurrection of Jesus himself. Because John does not specifically label all the signs by number, it is hard to be certain that John intended either outline. What is clear is that his first sign is linked with the summary statement of the purpose of the book in John chapter 20 and verse 30 to 31. In both places, the disciples saw and believed. So chapter 2 and verse 11 says his disciples believed on him, and it's repeated in chapter 20 and verse 29. The time would come when blessing would be pronounced on new generations of followers who could not possibly see these events, but who have nevertheless believed and seen something of the glory in these signs. So, the first sign was the miracle at Cana, the turning of water into wine. Now, we talked about that a couple Bible studies ago, so we won't spend too much time on that, although I do want to go over to, let me see, no, that's a different one. I want to go just right here. The first sign revealed the glory of Jesus and resulted in the disciples coming to a deeper faith. In other words, chapter 2 and verse 11, his disciples believed on him. It increased their faith. In other words, it resulted in their coming to a deeper understanding about Christ. This was firmly because it was a nature miracle. It revealed him as one through whom all things were made. It revealed that he was a creator. He could create something out of something very different. In other words, because it was a nature miracle, he turned water into wine. And secondly, it revealed that he had come to turn the old, perhaps the old Israel, into a new one, into something new and revivifying, or in other words, with life in it. I do want to go to, there in each one of these signs that are illustrated here in the book of John, there are Old Testament prophets that predicted it. It's about the millennial time. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 25 and verses 6 to 8. So this idea of the wine, the new wine, you're probably going to recognize some of these scriptures. We read them at the Feast of Tabernacles. But these 7 signs in John, these 7 miracles in the book of John, each one of them presages something that's going to happen in the millennium or when Christ returns. Isaiah chapter 25, verse 6 to 8. And in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all the people a feast of things, a feast of wines on the lees, or enough wine which are kept for a long time. Wines on the lees are those that have been fermented for a long time, strained through a cloth, and they are then considered to be excellent quality wine. Fat things, meaning of animals that have been fattened up and ready to eat. Full of marrow, of wines on the lees, well refined. So wines on the lees, well refined, good quality wine, as something God is going to serve on his mountain, is predicted here in the book of Isaiah for an event in or a time in the millennium. So when Jesus Christ's first miracle was to turn water into wine, perhaps he had a message there about changing something, water representing the old Israel, into the time when Israel was going to be the spiritual Israel, and then, of course, even the physical Israel reestablished into their old places, but this time under God's law and with them behaving and obeying him. So Israel was now emerging out of the old, so to speak. God was creating a new spiritual Israel. We won't have to turn there, but recall back in John chapter 15, he said that he was the vine and they were the fruit, or they were the grapes, and they were to produce fruit. Fruit in that case is understood as being wine. The wine is called the fruit of the vine, not just the grapes. So perhaps there's a meaning there too in chapter 15, verses 1 to 6 in John. But first, let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 17. Yeah, 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 17 says, "Therefore, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Behold, old things are passed away, all things are become new." So this lesson of becoming a new creature, or wine instead of water, a new creation, was taught by the Apostle Paul and is illustrated by that first miracle. Let's also go to Galatians chapter 6. There are several of these, but we just have time to go to a couple of them here. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 15. "For in Christ Jesus neither circumcision avails anything nor uncircumcision, but a new creature." So what really matters is becoming a new creature. And then verse 16, "As many as walk according to this rule," which is the rule of becoming a new creature. So as water was changed into wine, we are to become new creatures. And finally, that process involves a new heart. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 36 and verse 26. Ezekiel 36 and verse 26. Let me see here. Okay. Ezekiel 36 and verse 26 is about a new heart being given to everyone. "A new heart also I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you an heart of flesh." So we have a complete change of person, because the heart is the core of the person. So they're going to be changed into someone different, just like the water was changed into wine. Now, elsewhere in John's Gospel, the revealing of Christ's glory also was a revealing of his true, unique sonship with the Father, but we won't talk about that for the moment. Now, the second sign we want to look at, the second sign in the book of John, is healing a man who was either very sick or had died from a distance. Let's go to John chapter 4 and verse 46. This is after the account in John 4 about the woman at the well. And so this is later. He's returned back to Cana. John chapter 4, we can begin in verse 46. "And this proved that Jesus Christ was not limited to the territory where he was, or the immediate surroundings. He performed miracles, gave life to a dying son from a great distance away." John chapter 4, let's look in verse 46. "So Jesus again came back into Cana of Galilee." So this is where he had made water into wine. This was very close to the town he grew up in of Nazareth. So he came back to Cana in the Galilee. So from John 2 to John 4, the last part of the chapter, Christ went down into Samaria, down to the woman at the well there, Jacob's well. Now he's come back to Cana. So he kind of made a circle around the Sea of Galilee. And it says, And there was a certain nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. Okay, now here's one of these examples where you really need to stop and look at what the word actually means and think of some other scriptures where it actually is put together. Now, the word nobleman here is basilikos. It means an officer of the prince. It's also used in Acts 12 and James 2:8. It literally means one of the royal family or an officer of Herod Antipas, who at that point was tetrarch of Galilee. I want to show you here why this is important. So it's so easy to pass over so many of these things and not get why they're important. Let me see the one I've got in here. Yeah, Jesus Christ healing the official's son. Healing the official's son, huios, in these verses bears some resemblance to the healings of the centurion servant, but this is not the same account. This is not a centurion. This is an advisor to Herod Antipas, who was essentially the son of one of the many sons of King Herod, and he was a longtime ruler of that part of the world. I think he ruled from 4 BC to 39 AD, so quite a long time. Now, it does mention that let me see, there's no evidence that the royal official was a Gentile. The centurion was a Gentile. This royal official was very likely a Jew or an Idumean Jew who was simply serving in Herod's court. So Jesus was in Samaria for 2 days. Remember, after the woman at the well and he and the people of the town came out and they talked, he left for Galilee, and of course that's where we find ourselves now. But we have this account of this person who was a royal official. Sometimes the word is rendered nobleman in the Bible. Herod Antipas, he was a tetrarch of Galilee from 4 BC to 39 AD. Not properly called a king, but called a tetrarch. It was kind of like a sub-king or a king of a smaller portion. Unlike the Gentile centurion in Matthew, which he is often compared with, which of course is a mistake. Now let's look at the account. We have this healing that happened. It says, this nobleman whose son was sick at Capernaum. So Cana was about 700 feet elevation above Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee, which is down about 700 feet below sea level. And so we have a little trip. The trip uphill would have taken a little longer than the trip downhill, but certainly several hours of traveling or hiking. So when Jesus was come into Galilee, Judea of Galilee, he went into him and besought him that he would come down and heal his son, for he was at the point of death. So this individual, who was a servant apparently to Herod Antipas, had heard about Jesus, and he went to find him because his son was very sick and was about to die. So the verse 40, this is an interesting reaction, because when the man asked Jesus if he would heal him, he said to him, "Except you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." Now this is a strong indication that this man was Jewish, that he was not a Roman, because that's what he also said to the Jews. An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. So he said, except you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. Now some of the commentaries I looked at said they believe this was a statement given to the entire crowd that was gathered there, that he's telling them all, well, unless all of you, you're all this way, unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. And so he wasn't going to perform some miracle in front of them. He just simply told the nobleman that your son is going to be healed. The nobleman said unto him, "Sir, come down, or my child will die." And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your son lives." So he simply gave that statement to him. And the man believed the word that Jesus had spoken unto him, and he went his way. So he believed what Christ said, and then he went his way. In other words, he headed back down the hill to go back down to Capernaum. And as he was going down, his servants met him and told him, saying, "Your son lives." Then he inquired of them the hour when he began to amend. And they said to him, "Yesterday at the 7th hour the fever left him." Now, what that means is the 7th hour would be about 1 in the afternoon. So the man then would have left in a fairly short time and headed down the hill. And by the time he ran into these people who were his fellow house servants or servants in his house, it would have been after sunset. And so that would have been yesterday in their terms. That would have been, well, yesterday, meaning before the sunset, the day before, at about the 7th hour, his fever left him. So the father knew that it was at the same hour in which Jesus said to him, "Your son lives," and he himself believed, and his whole house. So verse 54, this again is the second miracle that Jesus did when he was come out of Judea into Galilee. So here he does say this was the second miracle or the second sign, but it's important that we understand that this had some other effects. There were other. Let's go over to Luke chapter 23 and verse 7 to 8. Luke chapter 23, verses 7 to 8. Now, this is when Christ was on trial before Pilate, and Pilate heard of Jesus and found out he was a Galilean. Verse 6 of Luke chapter 23 and verse 6. And as soon as he knew, he therefore belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, and he sent him to Herod. This is the same Herod Antipas that this nobleman would have been the servant or the advisor to, administrator for, I guess might be a good part. Said, who himself also was at Jerusalem at that time. So when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him for a long season, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have some miracle done by him. So he may have heard about this nobleman's son being healed. That may have been the first miracle he heard about. And then after that, of course, he would have heard about many others. But of course, Christ answered him nothing. He was not going to do some sort of a magic show to prove who he was. And all of Herod's taunts were simply, for the purpose of ridiculing and making fun. They were not at all of any sincere questions. He answered sincere questions from Pilate, which is interesting, but completely was mute, said nothing in front of Herod Antipas. Now, so here we have this, he gave life to this dying son. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 35 and verse 5. As we mentioned, there are prophecies in Isaiah or other major prophets, other prophets, that tie into each one of these 7 signs or miracles in the book of John. So Isaiah chapter 35 and verses 5 to 6 says, the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be opened, and the lame man shall leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing. For in the wilderness shall waters break out, and streams in the desert, talking about waters of healing. Now, we will go in a minute to the man who had been lame for 38 years, and also the one who was blind. So here we have the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be stopped, and the lame man leaping. And so Christ performed all 3 of these miracles during his ministry as a type of the healing and the type of miracles that are going to be performed in the millennium. So some of what the book of John here is telling us is kind of giving us a glimmer and a picture of what's going to be happening when Christ comes again. So Isaiah made clear that the new age will be an age of healing, and the disciples were witnesses of all this and, of course, what had happened. So they knew that they were witnesses of something that would be, completely different than the world that they lived in. Okay, now we're going to go to number 3 and see how we're doing on time. I think we're going to make it. Number 3 is at the pool of Bethesda. This is the third sign revealing the power of Jesus and fulfilling one of the prophecies. Again, of course, the power of Jesus to enable a man who had been lame for 38 years to walk. Now, there are quite a few commentators who believe the fact that he was lame for 38 years was a type of the 38 years that the children of Israel walked in the wilderness. They came out, they had a little bit of time, and they gave them the commandments, built the tabernacle. But the time they were actually just wandering from place to place was 38 years. So at the end of the 38, they had about 9 months left before they would then begin that trek down the eastern side of the Jordan River, and then, of course, camp there at Gilgal, where they then crossed. And that was exactly 40 years to the day later, to the time later when they crossed into the Promised Land. 40 years later since the Passover that they left Egypt. But their time of wandering, simply following the cloud and setting up the tent and staying there for a few months and going somewhere else, was 38 years plus a little bit. So there are some who believe this 38-year time when this man was lame represented those people of Israel who were lame during those 38 years. They basically were lame. They had nothing to do but walk around, kind of like most of us in our houses now, I guess. Or not much to do but lay around and do not much, although I know people are trying to keep busy. Home Depot's busy. I had to talk to a guy at Par Lumber today about a door, and he said that on an average day they get 300 to 400 phone calls. They've been averaging 1,600 since this thing started. So a lot of people are calling and ordering building materials, and even though construction is supposed to be shut down, people are doing a lot at their own houses, or at least planning for the work they're going to do whenever it's done. So this third sign reveals the power of Jesus to enable the man who had been lame for 38 years to walk, and resulted in both unbelief on behalf of those who did not understand it and faith in those who did. Now, this is an interesting third illustration or third miracle in the book of John, because it shows us not only Christ's healing power, but it also shows us that people who see clear evidence have in their head the ability to deny it and still try to either lie about it or simply come up with a reason to deny that Christ was the Messiah. This was a reference to the 38 years, perhaps, of the lame years in the wilderness. Isaiah, we already read Isaiah 35:6 about the healing of the lame was specifically mentioned, and of course, this fulfilled that, and he healed them from their lameness at that point. The response of the Judaizers. First, let's read this account, and then I'm going to read some commentaries, a couple of them here that we have. So let's look at John chapter 5, the troubled pool at Bethesda. Now, if you've been to Jerusalem, you know there are two major pools mentioned in the Gospels. The pool at Bethesda. I don't have a map. I was going to bring a big map, but I couldn't find it. But if you look at the Mount of Olives to the east of Jerusalem, that you have the Kidron Valley, but if you come down, the northeasternmost gate is the gate that is, well, there are several different names to it, but it's the Fish Gate. At one point it was called that. It's also called St. Stephen's Gate and some others. But at any rate, right beyond that gate is this pool called the Pool of Bethesda. And it's a tiered with two different large pools. They've excavated it, and it's pretty accurate. And it also was mentioned as the pool of having 5 porches or arches, and verse 2 says that. There was at Jerusalem by the sheep market, or the sheep gate, that's also another name for that gate, a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. So the porches had these arches that went over them. They're kind of like big Roman arches. So there's 5 porches that people could go down into these pools, and there's these arches. Today there's about 2 of the arches left. We were there, last year in October, and went down and saw the Pool of Bethesda. There's still a little bit of water, but they've got it all made into a park type thing now, a tourist area to go see. So the Pool of Bethesda is not large. I would guess it's like 2 swimming pools, not backyard, but 2 maybe motel-sized swimming pools. Maybe one of them a little bit bigger than that. But that's where they went. The other body of water is the Pool of Siloam, and you're all familiar with that because that's where Hezekiah's tunnel terminates. It comes down to the Pool of Siloam, and that is in southeast Jerusalem. And that's the one where Hezekiah's tunnel comes from up in the area where there's a spring and brings water down to it. And it's recently been excavated, and the stairs going down to that have been excavated, so you can go down. You can in one day, or actually in a matter of about an hour or two, you can go from one to the other and see them both. They're both certainly worth seeing, but understand this is the pool up to the north, which is by the sheep gate, and it was one where it says there lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. The Pool of Siloam was more like where they went to get their daily water. They got their water pots and filled them up. The Pool of Bethesda was one where they were around there waiting to be healed. And they were people who were blind, halt, withered, and waiting. For an angel went down at a certain season into the pool and troubled the water. And whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. Now, this may have been at a time of a holy day. There's traditions that had happened every year on Passover or on the Day of Trumpets. We really don't know, but it was one of those little miracles that God kept going to keep the people of Israel with a little bit of faith anyway, that he was going to send a Messiah, and to keep them a little bit spiritually oriented because they were obviously in the throes of Phariseeism and had a lot of other great issues with the Roman Empire and other things. But the angel went down and troubled the water. There was a certain man there which had an infirmity 38 years. And Jesus saw him lying and knew that he had been a long time in that case. And he said to him, would you like to be healed, or will you be whole? And the impotent man answered and said, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool, but while I am coming, another steps down before me. And Jesus said to him, Rise, take up your bed, and walk. So this is the third great miracle recorded in John. So why did Jesus not heal the others? Well, it's not explained, but there was a lesson here that would be fulfilled because this one man was healed. It would have been a great time for him to make a big demonstration of his power if that's what he wanted to do. But of course, he didn't. He could have healed all of them. But he healed this one man, and it says he immediately was made whole, took up his bed and walked, and the same day was on the Sabbath. So it was on a Sabbath, or it may have actually been a holy day, like the first day of unleavened bread. But we're not sure about that. It's just kind of a conjecture. Jesus therefore said unto him, it just says, see, the first verse of chapter 5, this was a feast of the Jews. So it was originally God said, these are my feasts, but by the time this had happened, they had changed the names of the time to the Feast of the Jews. And of course, the Judeans or the Jews were the only ones keeping them, as opposed to the Romans and the Greeks and the others that were also living in the area. But that's another study. So Christ said, take up your bed and walk. And it was the Sabbath day. The Jews therefore said to him that was cured, it is the Sabbath day, it's not lawful for you to carry your bed. Now the bed would have been somewhat like a roll-up quilt or a roll-up mat. It was not heavy. It wasn't some huge piece of lumber with a big mattress or box springs like we have. So, but they simply said, you can't carry that around. And he answered them, he said, he that made me whole, the same said to me, take up your bed and walk. So Christ told him to pick up that rolling mat and or mattress, whatever it was, it's kind of a mattress or quilt or mat, and carry it. And they asked him, where is this man which said to you, take up your bed and walk? And he that was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had conveyed himself away or went away, and the multitude being in that place. So it just means that he escaped. The word that he went away or took up or left simply means that he had escaped. So he that was healed didn't know where Jesus had escaped to. Afterwards, Jesus found him in the temple. So perhaps he went there to give thanks. Maybe he could give an offering or just went to the temple. And he said unto him, behold, you are made whole. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come unto you. Now this is used as proof that he was sick the first time because he had sinned or his parents had sinned. It's not what Christ meant. What Christ meant was sin no more, or else the worst thing, which would be the lake of fire, would happen to him. That the worst thing, there's not much worse than being unable to walk, quadriplegic for 38 years. In this case, Christ said simply, sin no more, lest a worse thing, which of course obviously we understand as a lake of fire, would come upon him. So the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus which had made him whole. So they had asked him, I guess, who was it? And so he said, well, Jesus, he's the one who made me whole. Therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. So they weren't thankful to God that this man who had been wounded and hurt for 38 years was now healed. They instead tried to accuse Christ of something because he had broken their rules about what they did on the Sabbath day. Now, so let me read a commentary here. It might seem as remarkable, but the response of the Judaizers was to ignore the miracle and complain that it was performed on the Sabbath, at a time when there was no life-threatening condition. In other words, it wasn't an ox in the ditch, it was just a man who's laying there hurting. But of course, that would be an ox in the ditch if you were the one that was laying there hurting. More important, their display of power of God, the Messiahship of Jesus, they were jealous of. They were so taken with their own traditions, they overlooked the fact that in such a healing, God must have been involved. The sign thus passed by them. Jesus, however, specifically drew their attention to the fact, his reply was that it was his Father who had performed this work on the Sabbath, and that he had done it along with him. He was thus indicating that he would be seen on a parallel with the Father, and he thus had the right to do what he would on the Sabbath. Compare that to Mark 2 and verse 28, where Christ is the Lord of the Sabbath. But they could not see because of their blindness, their spiritual blindness. They looked past the good that was done and simply said, well, you're violating our rules, therefore we have to be critical. Now, the healing of the pool of Bethsaida in the commentary here mentions He said, John repeatedly ties this narrative to various Jewish feasts. Chapter 2 and verse 13 says Passover. Chapter 6 and verse 4 says Passover. Chapter 7 and verse 2 says Tabernacles. Chapter 10 and verse 22 says Dedication. 11:55 says Passover. This is the only feast in the book of John that is not identified. We don't know what feast it is. This passage here, chapter 5 and verse 1, is the only feast that is not specifically mentioned as a Passover, Tabernacles, or whatever. It's probably Passover. That's the best guess, which would make then the fourth Passover in the book of John, which would lead to the conclusion that obviously Christ's ministry lasted 3.5 years. Started at a Passover and ended at a Passover. It started at the Feast of Trumpets and then ended at a Passover. At any rate, if the Passover intended it would mean that Christ's ministry extended to a period of 3.5 years. Some have advocated for Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, but he says the matter is simply we don't know what feast John was mentioning to here. And so we just really don't know. As far as the pool goes, it's located near the Church of St. Anne in the northeast quarter of the Old City, near Nehemiah's Sheep Gate. There were 2 pools lying north and south, surrounded by 4 covered colonnades in a rough trapezoid with a 5th colonnade separating the 2 pools. There are some who believe that these 5 arches or pillars in the Pool of Bethsaida each represented one of the 5 books of Moses, and they would come there and read them every day. So maybe that does make sense considering the society they lived in, that each one of these pillars was a different book, and a man would stand there and read Leviticus, go to the next one and read Deuteronomy, whatever, Judges, not Judges, but Deuteronomy. So here we have kind of an interesting, perhaps, sidelight on this third miracle, this healing of the man who had been for 38 years unable to walk. The fourth sign in the book of John is about Jesus Christ's creative power to multiply bread and fish, but also to feed people, thus revealing himself as greater than Moses, giving more than just manna from sky, but turning a small amount of bread or fish into something that's much larger. So let's read that little account. It's called the Feeding of the 5,000. And this is number 4. Sign number 4 begins in chapter 6 and verse 1. After these things went Jesus over the Sea of Galilee, to the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Now Tiberias was a town that was founded by Herod on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, and eventually, because the town was called Tiberias, the sea became known as Tiberias. In the Old Testament, it was called Kinnereth because it's shaped like a harp. And the word harp means Kinnereth, or Kinnereth means harp in Hebrew, so it was called the Lake of Kinneret or Kinnereth. Then it was later in the New Testament times called Sea of Galilee, but by the time John wrote in the late 1st century, it was also called the Sea of Tiberias. And a great multitude followed him because they saw his miracles which he did, and on them that were diseased. And Jesus went up into a mountain, and he sat there with his disciples. A feast, it says, and Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. So here's one of those Passovers that was mentioned here in the book of John. When Jesus lifted up his eyes, he saw a great company coming to him, and he said, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" Then he said to prove him, for he himself knew what he would do. And Philip answered, 200 pennyworth of bread, which is about 8 months' salaries, as some of the commentaries bring out, is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may take a little. Then one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here which has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes, but what are they among so many?" So this is at about Passover time, would have been in the earlier part of the year, probably not the days of unleavened bread yet, but very close. It says the Passover was close, so it hadn't happened yet, it was coming on. And so we have these 5 barley loaves and 2 small fishes. The total is 7, but it doesn't, we're trying to assign too much significance to the 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. You can kind of get yourself into some speculation that doesn't really matter. But certainly he said to them, "Make the men sit down." There was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed to the disciples, and the disciples to them that were sat down, likewise of the fishes, as much as they would. And when they were filled, he said to them, to the disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Therefore they gathered them together and filled 12 baskets with the fragments and of the 5 barley loaves which remained over and above unto them that had eaten. Now later he asked the disciples if they understood the significance of the fact that there were 12 baskets of fragments that were collected. And the best conclusion, of course, is that would be one for each of the disciples. Each one of them had a commission to then bring forth fruit, spread food, spiritual food, and have a harvest from that. So we're not quite sure exactly what the 12 is, but that there were also 12 tribes of Israel. Perhaps it signifies something about spiritual Israel. We really don't know, but probably had a meaning for the disciples because Christ himself asked them about it, and it may have meant that they were all to be spreading truth and collecting bread or collecting back fruit for God. So he points out later that he is the true bread of life. The rest of the chapter is about Jesus Christ himself being the real bread of life. Verse 35, I am the bread of life. He that comes to me shall never hunger. So this lesson, this fourth lesson here, prepared the way for the discourse on the bread of life, which of course is one of the more famous in the entire Bible. He says, we must look beyond the miraculous bread to him, as the people rightly recognize this miracle was again messianic, because just like Moses gave, or God gave during the time of Moses, gave manna, Christ was giving true bread, which was himself, that we were to eat of. The writer brings out the important message that they misrepresented or misinterpreted, how they should respond because of their earth-mindedness. They wanted to be fed miraculously, but they did not want the bread of spiritual life that they really should have. And of course, later he continues on in the chapter, John 6 and verse 44, none can come to me unless the Father draws or calls him. I'll raise him up the last day. So a lot of spiritual truth and a lot of things that we read at Passover, John chapter 6 and verse 35 or 55. My flesh is meat indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He that eats my flesh and drinks my blood dwells in me, and I in him. So once again, we have faith and bread, and illustrated by Jesus Christ's using of the example of bread to symbolize his teachings and his own body. Now I want to read Carson's little comment here on that. There we go. It was a great crowd of people. They were on the Sea of Galilee. The Greek tos oros does not necessarily refer to a particular mountain or hillside, but they're obviously, you go to the land of Israel, and every place has been deemed some holy place in the Bible. So there is a mount of where this was given up on above Tiberias, and there's a Catholic church built up there, and the Catholics ruin everything they touch as far as historically speaking. But there is a nice hillside there that may have been the exact hillside that he was on. So this is the second of 3 Passovers mentioned in John, and it's about to happen at that point. Let's go on down a little bit. We have Philip's response that it would take a huge amount of money to buy that. And of course, a little bit later, the total number of people may have exceeded 10,000 or more. Certainly of just 5,000 men, who knows how many women and children may have come along. So there may have been one of those things where the Romans were looking, or the Jews were looking, saying this guy is drawing crowds of thousands. He could certainly put together an army much bigger than some of the previous guys who had come along and called themselves the Messiah. That there were 12 baskets is almost certainly significant. The Lord has enough to supply the needs of all the 12 tribes of Israel. All 4 Gospels give this account and draw attention to the number of baskets of fragments that were picked up. So it must be somewhat important. And of course, there's quite a bit, quite a lot of people postulating about that. But the truth of the matter is, this fourth sign revealed the power of Jesus to feed the world, to feed us spiritually, and that, of course, set up the significance of the bread of life. I want to go to Isaiah chapter 58 and verse 14. Isaiah 58 and verse 14. Then shall you delight yourself in the Lord, and I will cause you to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. So prophetically speaking about the time when the Messiah is going to be ruling, And then, of course, the last part, a lot of this is about the Sabbath day, keeping the Sabbath. But God says he would cause us to ride upon the high places of the earth and to be fed with the heritage of Jacob, or the land that Jacob was promised, and also the truth that he was promised. So we have this miracle of the bread and this feeding of the 5,000. That is the fourth sign. And it was set up for one of the great teachings about Christ being the bread of life, great teachings in the Gospels. Now, the fifth sign is the walking on the water. Let's go to John chapter 6, beginning in verse 15. This is a very short little account here. When Jesus therefore perceived that they would come and make him and take him by force to make him a king, he departed again by a mountain to himself. So after he had fed these 5,000 people, perhaps 10,000, but 5,000 men, they decided they wanted to make him king. And so they were trying, maybe it was kind of a crowd type thing, just as a sidelight. Well, just hold your place there. Just go over one page to John chapter 7. And look in John chapter 7 and verse 1. After these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he would not walk in Jewry, or in the area of Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Well, the Jews were seeking to kill him, but a lot of the other people who lived there were seeking to make him a king. And now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. His brethren, now that, remember, Christ had at least 5 brothers. It says, his brethren therefore said to him, depart hence and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you do. They were really wanting Christ to perform public miracles and maybe then become the king, or of course they were the king's brother. That wouldn't be all that bad of a lot in life. Verse 4, for there is no man that does anything in secret, and he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. It's kind of I don't know. I'm surprised he didn't get mad at him. You know, well, if you can perform miracles, man, go out and perform them. You know, let's get everybody following us. Let's throw the Romans off, and let's take over this wealthy part of the world. We can own the temple, whatever. But the answer is in verse 5, neither did his brethren believe in him. And he said to them, my time is not yet come. And his time will come when he returns from heaven on a horse, white horse, Revelation 19. That's when his time will come to rule the world. So John chapter 7, his own brethren wanted him to, just like these people did in verse 15, or verse 15, they were going to take him by force and make him king. So what he did is he went down to the lake. Verse 16, when even was come, his disciples went down to the sea, and they knew that he had gone down to the lake. So they went into a ship, or a boat, big open boat, and went over the sea towards Capernaum. So they were going to go out and travel over to Capernaum. And it was now dark, and Jesus did not come with them. So maybe they had arranged to meet him at Peter's mother's house, because Peter's mother's house is in Capernaum, or just somewhere. We really don't know. But verse 18, the sea arose by reason of a great wind that blew. So the Sea of Galilee is famous for quick storms that have almost no warning. So the sea arose by a great reason of a great wind. So when they had rowed about 520 or 30 furlongs, which is about 2.5, 3 miles, maybe 4 miles, just less than 4 miles, they see Jesus walking on the sea and drawing close to the ship, and they were afraid. Now, other accounts say that they thought he was a ghost, but they were afraid. And he said to them, it is I, be not afraid. Then they willingly received him into the ship, and immediately the ship was at the land where they went. So it kind of crossed the Sea of Galilee 4 or 5 miles in an instant, plus the storm was abated. So this fifth sign revealed the power of Jesus Christ to control nature itself. It indicated that he could control the waters. In fact, let's go to Psalm 77:19. This is kind of an interesting parallel, because in Psalms talk about the God ruling the waters and the oceans, which is exactly what he did here. So it was a sign of his messiahship, a sign that he was God. Psalm 77, let's begin in verse 14. You are the God that does wonders. You have declared your strength among the people. You have with your arm redeemed your people, the sons of Jacob and Joseph. Verse 16, the waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you, and they were afraid. The depths were also troubled. The clouds poured out water, the skies sent out a sound, your arrows also went abroad. The voice of your thunder was in the heaven, the lightnings lighted the world, and the earth trembled and shook. The way is in the sea, and your path in the great waters, and your footsteps are known. And you led your people like a flock by the hand, as a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. So in this case, we have God being over the waters, that the waters were poured out, and they did essentially what he told them to do. So this fifth sign reveals his power over nature. It also is a sign that he was deity, that he controlled the weather and he controlled the creation. So how he managed to cross the without a boat, of course, we're all, obviously we know about that he just simply walked on the water. He's not constrained by normal laws of physics as we would understand them. So let me go, I want to mention just one little comment here about that that's not what we want there. There we go. So he was a powerful liberator of people who had storms. There are, by the way, if you go on the internet, there are people who have listed the lessons of the walking on water incident, that God can calm the storms in our life, and that no matter how much we panic, we'll be able to be taken care of. But at any rate, we certainly have just a good example of Christ himself being able to calm the waters and being in charge of all of the creation. Let me see Jesus walks on the water. The reasons why John included this paragraph, even though there's no dialogue or discourse in it, is simply, obviously, he wanted to show Christ's complete control, his complete control over the waters. The disciples saw Christ approaching on the water. The last phrase mentions that they were obviously very afraid. He mentions here that the expression ego menti means I am. He mentioned over in the book of Mark. But once reassured, the disciples were willing to take him into the boat, which immediately reached the shore where they were heading. If the language is taken strictly, this suggests another miracle, possibly an allusion to Psalm 107, was that he guided them to their desired haven. So that could be true also. But the important thing is that he showed he was the God over all of the creation. He was not subject to it, which in Gnosticism, that would have been, I think, a very important element, that he was over all the creation. He was not subject to it. Okay, number 6, and I think time-wise we're heading on. We got a little bit of time. Okay, the 6th sign that Christ revealed was in healing of the blind man, the man that was blind from birth. Let's go to chapter 9 and verse 1. John chapter 9 and verse 1. Now there's some very significant feeling to this because people are born blind. All people essentially are born blind from birth. It takes God's Spirit opening our mind to let us see spiritually. John chapter 9, beginning in verse 1. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man that was blind from birth. His disciples asked him, saying, Master, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? He answered, Neither this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be made manifest in him. So they believed, their society believed, that a person who was born with a sin, it was because of their parents. If something bad happened to them, they got sick, whatever, they felt it was God's punishment. There are still religions today that believe that. I believe Zoroastrianism and some others believe pretty much that. And of course, there are some who believe in the health and wealth gospel, that if you're righteous, God will give you more money and finances, which of course is not in any way near scriptural. But let's continue here. Verse 4, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night comes when no man can work. So it just says that the works of God should be made manifest, and then he illustrates that work by healing the man, showing us that God the Father sent him to do things like healing. That was part of the works that he was sent to do. He says the night comes when no man can work. So when he would be gone, there would be persecution, and there would be things that would be much, much different. As long as I am in the world, lo, I am the light of the world. We talked about that last Bible study, Christ being the light of the world versus the darkness of Satan. When he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground, made a clay of the spittle, and anointed the eyes of the blind man, and said, Go wash in the pool of Siloam. Now, the pool of Siloam was not the pool of Bethesda. The pool of Siloam was down south of the temple, and was where Hezekiah's tunnel terminated. And so this was a different pool, a different body of water. So he performed miracles using both bodies of water here in the book of John. Pool of Siloam, which means by interpretation, sent. And he went his way therefore, and washed, and came seeing. Now the neighbors therefore, which had seen him, he was blind, said, Isn't he that sat and begged? And some said, This is he. Others said, He is like him. But he said, No, I am he. I'm the one who was sitting blind and was begging. And some said, This is he. Others said, It's like him. He said, No, I am he. Therefore they said to him, How is it that your eyes are opened? And he answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes, and said to me, Go wash in the pool of Siloam. I went and washed and received sight. And they said to him, Where is he? He said, I know not. Now, here we have an example of spiritual blindness and physical blindness being healed, but their spiritual blindness being unhealed, staying with them. They brought him to the Pharisees that aforetime was blind. And it was on the Sabbath day when Jesus made the clay. So this was on the Sabbath day, and they, of course, determined that no one should be putting clay on somebody's eyes on the Sabbath. I'm not sure exactly how that was rationalized, but that's it. Then again, the Pharisees asked him how he'd received his sight, and he told them again, He put clay on my eyes and washed, and I do see. Therefore, some of the Pharisees said, This man is not of God, because he keeps not the Sabbath day. Which, of course, he kept God's Sabbath day. He did not keep their rules of the Sabbath day or their interpretations of their rules of the Sabbath day. Others said, How could a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. And they said unto the blind man, What do you say of him that he has opened your eyes? He said, Well, he must be a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. So that just shows you how they willingly refuse facts and truth. And the same is true today when people have a religious idea firmly implanted in their head, takes parking space in their brain. They simply don't turn loose of it. It's going to take a miracle from God to open their mind and make it different. So the Jews said, Well, until we call their parents. So they asked him, saying, Is this your son, who you say was born blind? How does he now see? His parents answered and said, We know this is our son, and that he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we don't know. Or who has opened his eyes, we don't know. For he is of age, ask him, he'll speak for himself. And of course, this is why the Pharisees were blind. They would not believe Christ was even a prophet, but they simply wanted to refuse it. These words spoke his parents because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. So that's the beginning of persecuting of Christians right here. Or if any of the Jews, this is before the crucifixion, this is before a whole lot of things happened. If anyone confessed or publicly admitted that Christ was the Son of God or believed in him, that he was the Messiah, he'd be put out of the synagogue. And of course, people have been put out of the synagogues and out of their church meetings ever since, if they were not part of the established church of Rome or other churches that established themselves. So these people began to be persecuted for following Jesus Christ long before Christ was crucified or the church was established on the day of Pentecost. And again, the Pharisees called the man in. Verse 24, they called him that was blind and said to him, Give God the praise, which means, swear on an oath of Bibles or whatever. Swear, give God the praise, meaning by the authority of God, tell us what happened, because we know this man is a sinner. And he answered and said, Whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I know, that where I was blind, I now see. And they said to him again, What did he to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered them, I have told you already, and you did not hear. Wherefore would you hear it again? will you also be his disciples? And they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke unto Moses. As for this fellow, we know what from whence he is. And the man answered and said unto them, why, herein is a marvelous thing, that you know not from whence he is, and yet he has opened my eyes. So we have this man telling them off, basically telling them the truth, and they were unwilling to listen. But that just tells us what reveals to us how people whose minds are closed simply cannot understand, and they're not willing to, and they become angry when it becomes obvious. Now, Carson mentions here, this chapter portrays what happens when the light shines. Some are able to see it, like this man who was born blind, while others who think they see turn away and remain blinded. Very important statement. Some who think they see turn away and remain blinded. And of course, that still happens a great deal in our time. So we have the symbolism in this chapter about being blind from birth is very obvious. People are born not having any knowledge of God. Signals that human beings are born spiritually blind from birth. And there's actually quite a bit in that in this commentary, but I want to, for sake of time, I want to go over to Romans chapter 11. Let's go to Romans chapter 11 and verse 25. Romans 11, verse 25. Paul is talking about the blindness that's happened to Israel. He's talking about the same blindness as is illustrated here by these Pharisees in the story of this man who was born blind. It's the same blindness. It's the same guys, the same group, same religion. He says, verse 25, I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own conceits, which they were, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles come in. So all Israel shall be saved, that it is written, but that's, of course, at a future time. So blindness has happened to really the world, not just to most of Israel, so that God could call others. In this case, he's talking about the fullness of the Gentiles could completely come in. So that blindness will be removed, but it is going to be a long time, for really the time of the second resurrection for most people. Okay, so time-wise, I think we're doing good. We have time for the seventh sign. So I didn't think we would have time to get through this, but we are. The seventh sign reveals Jesus as the giver of life and the only source of eternal life. Very important lesson here in the book of John. And that is, of course, the raising of Lazarus. Let's go to John chapter 11. This was the miracle that finally convinced the Jews that they must murder Jesus Christ. From that day forward, they said, we can't tolerate him anymore. We have to find a way to arrest him and kill him, because he has resurrected a man who was dead for 4 days, meaning that he has the power to raise up anyone who has ever lived, because the body is already seen then rotting in corruption. So the seventh sign reveals Jesus as the giver of life. The sixth sign, obviously, about him being the one able to open people's eyes and give them spiritual truth. But John chapter 11, we'll kind of skim through this for a second. Beginning in verse 1, a certain man was sick named Lazarus of Bethany. Bethany, a small town about 2 miles north or southeast of Jerusalem, used to cross the Mount of Olives. The town of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the Mary which had anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore his sisters sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. So Lazarus loved Christ. It was a very good friend or close to him. When Jesus heard this, by the way, he was up, but looks like about 30 miles away up to the south, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, for the Son of God might be glorified thereby. In other words, once this miracle took place, the Son of God would have the death sentence. The Pharisees and the scribes would have said, that is enough. We have to stop him. And they, of course, then sought to get Judas to betray him and arrest him. Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. When he heard, therefore, that he was sick, he abode 2 days in the same place where he was. So he didn't even run fast or drop what he was doing. He stayed 2 more days. Then after that, he said to his disciples, let us go to Judea again. His disciples said to him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone you, and you are going there again? He says, are there not 12 hours in a day? In other words, I have work to do, and it's daytime for me. I need to go get my work done. Verse 11, these things he said after he said to them, our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. His disciples said, Lord, if he sleep, he shall do well. But then in verse 14, Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. Now, no one had told him that, but he knew, because he was obviously the Messiah, the Christ. I am glad for your sakes I was not there, to the intent you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him. So we have Lazarus, who died. Christ waited 2 days, and during that 2 days' time, Lazarus died of his sickness. Let's drop down to verse 20. When Martha was, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him, but Mary sat still in the house. So Mary was mourning. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But I know even now that whatsoever you will ask of God, he will give it to you. She said, I have not lost faith in you as the Messiah. And Jesus said to her, your brother shall rise again. Martha said to him, well, he's up in heaven playing a harp, talking to Jesus. No, Martha didn't say that. Martha said, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So the truth of the Bible is very clearly understood by her, and she was taught by Jesus Christ himself. Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet he shall live. Whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? In other words, he's saying Lazarus is still alive because I am going to raise him up. So this shows that Jesus Christ is the source of life and is the source of the resurrection. He said, I will raise him up the last day, referring to the saints. So we have these very profound lessons. And of course, this lesson eventually was one that once the Jews heard about it, they said, that's enough. Verse 47, then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees of council and said, what shall we do? This man does many miracles. And they said, well, if we let him alone, all men are going to follow him, and we will lose our nation. The Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. And of course, from that day forward, verse 53, they took counsel together to put him to death. So we have this final miracle that was profound in that Lazarus was dead for 4 days, and then Christ raised him alive physically, but just proving that he has the power to raise up everyone who has ever lived or died. Now I want to go over to 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 16. 1 Timothy 6 and verse 16. This verse tells us that Christ alone has immortality. What it means is immortality to give. He is the only source of eternal life. There is no other. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 16. This says, let me see, verse 15, which in his times he shall show who is the blessed and only potentate, the King of kings and the Lord of lords. Now, that's at the appearing of Christ. Verse 14, you keep this commandment without spot and rebukable until the appearance of our Lord Jesus Christ. And essentially, when his times, after he returns, that will be his time, the day of the Lord, the times of the Lord, and he will show that he's the only potentate, the King of kings and the Lord of hosts, who only has immortality. So he's the only one that has immortality to give. In other words, the Greek words anastasia, athanasia, means immortality and means the only source of immortality. So the only source of immortality is Jesus Christ, and that was proven by this seventh sign in the book of John, this seventh miracle in the book of John. So these are the signs that are to inculcate or to help us have faith in Jesus Christ. Each one of them has a particular point or lesson to it. You might call them 7 pillars of Christ's teachings or 7 foundational truths illustrated by these signs in the book of John, however you would want to label them. But this is a kind of the framework of the book of John. The rest of the book of John simply extrapolates on these signs or these miracles and the lessons that we are to learn from each one of them. So I hope that helps you understand the book of John a little better, and we will continue next time with the subject, hopefully, of the love and the commandments in the writings of all 5 books of John.